The moment Frances Donnelly stepped off the westbound train at the Caldwell depot in the Kansas Territory on a sweltering afternoon in June of 1882, she understood with perfect clarity that something had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. The platform was alive with the usual chaos of a cattle town in full summer swing, drovers hollering at one another, merchants loading and unloading crates, a woman selling dried apple pies from a basket on her hip, horses stamping their hooves against the packed earth, and the great iron engine beside Frances hissing and belching its white clouds of steam into the blue sky above. And yet, in all that commotion, not a single soul was looking for her. She stood very still on the worn wooden planks of the platform, her traveling trunk at her feet, her reticule clutched in both gloved hands, and she looked left and looked right and then left again, and she waited. She was 24 years old. She had traveled alone from Cincinnati, Ohio, on a 3-day journey with nothing but a small packed lunch, and the letters of one Mr. Gerald Prout folded neatly against her heart in the pocket of her traveling jacket, and she had fully expected that Mr. Gerald Prout would be standing right here with his hat in his hand and his best smile on his face. Gerald Prout was not here. She waited 15 minutes, telling herself that a man could be delayed. A wheel on a wagon could break. A horse could throw a shoe. She smoothed the front of her navy blue skirt and stood straighter and watched the other passengers disperse one by one until the platform thinned out, and the train began to make the deep, rumbling sounds that indicated it would move along very soon. She waited 30 minutes and allowed herself, just once, the small private fear that she had perhaps gotten off at the wrong stop. She asked a young boy sweeping the far end of the platform whether this was indeed Caldwell, and he said yes, ma'am, proudly, as though Caldwell was the finest city in all of creation, and she thanked him and returned to her trunk. She waited an hour and the sun climbed higher, and the heat pressed down on her shoulders like a firm, unwelcome hand. The station master, a broad-chested man named Mr. Hollies with a gray mustache that curled up at both ends, came out of his little office with a clipboard and noticed her. He looked at her, then away, then back again, and finally walked over with the careful expression of a man who was trying to determine whether a situation required him to become involved. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his cap, "train's pulling out in 2 minutes. You waiting for someone?" "I am," she said, keeping her voice level. "Mr. Gerald Prout. He was to collect me here today. We are to be married." Something shifted behind Mr. Hollies's eyes, something he was quick to smooth over. "Gerald Prout," he repeated. "I see. Well, you are welcome to wait inside the station, miss, where it's a shade cooler. You don't want to be standing out here in the sun." She followed him inside, grateful for the relative cool of the small station building with its 2 wooden benches, its posted schedules, and its smell of sawdust and coal smoke. Mr. Hollies set a tin cup of water in front of her and went back to his business, and Frances sat down and folded her hands in her lap and determined that she would not cry. Not yet. Not until she had more information than she currently possessed. She read Gerald's letters again, though she nearly had them memorized by now. He had written to her twice a month, for 6 months after her name had been submitted through the matrimonial agency in Cincinnati. His letters were formal and polite and occasionally, in their better moments, almost warm. He had described his farm outside Caldwell a modest property, he had called it, with good soil and a little creek running through the east pasture, and he had told her that he was a hard-working, God-fearing man who wanted a steady woman and a proper home. He was 31 years old. He had included a small photograph. She looked at the photograph now. A thin man with a narrow face and a slightly receding hairline, standing stiffly beside a fence post. He had not been what she would have called handsome, but she had not required handsomeness. She had required reliability and steadiness and the honest desire to build something together. Cincinnati held nothing for her anymore, her mother 3 years gone, her father 2 years after that, her small income from giving piano lessons barely sufficient to cover her rent. And when the opportunity to come west and make a new life had presented itself, She had taken it with both hands. And now it was 2 hours since she had arrived, and Gerald Prout had not come, and Mr. Hollis kept glancing at her from behind his little window with that particular expression that she was beginning to recognize as pity mixed with reluctance. Finally, near the end of her second hour of waiting, Mr. Hollis came out from behind his window and sat down on the bench across from her and turned his cap in his hands, and Frances braced herself. "Miss Donnelly," he said, and the fact that he used her name told her he had done some investigating. "I ought to tell you something. I probably should have told you before now, and I apologize for that." "Tell me," she said. "Gerald Prout left Caldwell," Mr. Hollis said. "Packed up and left about 11 days ago. Word is he had some significant debts that came due all at once, and he didn't have the means to settle them, so he pulled up stakes. Headed south, some say. Others say he went to Colorado." Frances heard the words very clearly. Each one landed like a stone dropped into still water, and she let the ring spread out and settle before she spoke again. "He left," she said. "Yes, ma'am. Without sending word to me." Mr. Hollis looked pained. "I wouldn't know about that part, miss." She thought about the letters she had sent Gerald in the final weeks before her departure. 2 letters, both cheerful and practical, discussing what she might bring with her and what she might leave behind. She had sold most of her furniture to fund the train ticket. She had given up her room. She had said goodbye to the 2 women in her building who she might have called friends, and to the church she had attended since childhood, and to the grave where her parents lay side by side in the municipal cemetery. She had nothing and nowhere to return to. She was 24 years old, and she was sitting in a train depot in Caldwell, Kansas, with a trunk full of everything she owned and no one in the world to help her. She breathed in slowly and breathed out again. "Thank you for telling me, Mr. Hollis," she said. "Is there someone we can send a telegram to for you, family, friends back east?" "No," she said. "There is not." Mr. Hollis nodded slowly. "You are welcome to stay here for the rest of the afternoon," he said, with genuine kindness in his voice. "But I close up at 7 o'clock. There's a boarding house up on Main Street, Mrs. Yardley's place, clean and reasonable." "Thank you," she said again. He went back to his window, and Frances sat alone, and the 3rd hour began. She thought in a curiously detached way about what a person in her position was supposed to do. She had $23 in her reticule, which was all she had in the world after the cost of the train ticket. She had a trunk of clothing, a small collection of her mother's china wrapped carefully in newspaper, a well-worn Bible, and her skill at the piano, which required a piano in order to be useful. She did not know a single person in Caldwell, Kansas. She did not know this territory, this town, these people, these customs. She thought about the vast, flat, golden landscape she had seen from the train window as they had come into Caldwell, the endless grass and the enormous sky, and the cattle moving in dark masses across the distant hills. And she thought that this land was beautiful in a way that was completely indifferent to human suffering, and she found, strangely, that she did not hate it for that. She was still sitting with that thought when the depot door burst open with a bang that made her jump half off the bench. A man came through the doorway like a storm rolling in off the plains, tall and broad-shouldered, his boots striking the floorboards with force, his dark hat pushed back on his head, his dark hair damp at his temples, and his chest heaving as if he had been running hard and long. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed, with a jaw that needed a shave and eyes the color of good coffee that swept the room with swift, sharp urgency until they landed on her. He pulled up short when he saw her. He stood in the center of the depot and looked at her, and then pressed one hand briefly to the side of his chest, as if checking that his heart was still where he'd left it, and then he pulled off his hat with the other hand and said, "You are Frances Donnelly." It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. "I am." He crossed to her in 4 long strides and stopped just short of propriety and looked down at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, relief and distress and something else entirely, all in the same moment. "My name is Ralph Lockhart," he said. "I have a ranch about 4 miles east of town." I ride with a man by the name of Cody Barnes who works my cattle drives, and Cody is the one who told me about your situation, which I learned about not half an hour ago. I came as fast as I could get here." Frances looked up at him. He was very tall and the doorway light was behind him, and he was still breathing hard. "How did you come to hear about my situation?" she asked. "Cody's wife Nettie is Mr. Hollies' niece," Ralph said. "Mr. Hollies mentioned it to Nettie when he stopped by their house for his supper, and Nettie sent Cody out to find me, and here I am." He paused, and something in his expression shifted toward uncertainty, as if he was only now realizing how strange this might appear. "I realize I am a stranger to you," he said, "and I understand if you prefer to keep it that way. But I know Mrs. Yardley's boarding house, and it is a respectable enough place, and I'd like to see you there safely before dark if you'll allow it. And beyond that, well, I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing, about what comes next in terms of your plans." Frances studied him. She had been in her share of difficult situations, and she had learned out of necessity to read people quickly. This man, Ralph Lockhart, was not trying to conceal anything. His face was too open for concealment, too expressive, his discomfort at the situation written plainly across every feature. He was embarrassed on her behalf, she realized, not in the condescending way that Mr. Hollies had been, but in the genuine way of a man who found the injustice of her situation personally offensive. "You said your name is Lockhart," she said. "Yes." "As in Lockhart Ranch." His expression flickered briefly toward something like self-consciousness. "I suppose so, yes." She had not been in Caldwell long, but she had been there long enough to hear a man on the train platform say to another man, not 10 feet from where she had been standing with her trunk, that the Lockhart spread was the finest cattle operation in all of Sumner County. She filed that information away and looked at Ralph Lockhart again, at his honest face and his dusty boots, and the fact that he had come running to a train depot for a woman he had never met, and she made her decision. "I would be grateful for the escort, Mr. Lockhart," she said, "and I would be very willing to talk." He reached down and picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. She noticed that his hands were large and were cruffined, the hands of a man who did not merely oversee others' labor but participated in it himself. They walked out of the depot together into the long golden light of the late afternoon, and all around them Caldwell went about its noisy, dusty business, and Frances Donnelly, who had nothing and no one in this new world, walked beside the man who had come running and thought that this was perhaps not the end of her story, but rather, in some strange and not entirely unwelcome way, its beginning. Mrs. Yardley's boarding house was a 2-story white-painted building on the north end of Main Street, with a front porch that had 2 rocking chairs, and a hanging pot of geraniums that had survived the summer heat through what must have been extraordinary determination. Mrs. Yardley herself was a compact, no-nonsense woman of about 50 with iron-gray hair pinned firmly to her head and the kind of eyes that missed very little. She looked at Frances, and then at Ralph Lockhart, and then back at Frances, and she said nothing whatsoever about the unusual nature of the arrival, simply showed Frances to a clean room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the rooftops toward the open plain. Ralph waited downstairs, and when Frances came back down, having splashed her face and taken a steadying breath, he was standing in the front parlor with his hat in his hands, speaking with Mrs. Yardley in a low voice. They both stopped when she appeared. Mrs. Yardley excused herself with the practiced discretion of a woman who ran a boarding house and had therefore seen everything. There was a small sitting area near the parlor window, 2 chairs and a round table with a glass oil lamp on it. They sat, and Ralph turned his hat slowly in his hands and looked at her with that direct, unguarded way he had, and he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you are absolutely free to tell me to mind my own business." "Ask it," she said. "What do you intend to do?" Frances thought about this honestly. "I have $23, she said. "I have some china and some clothes, and I can play the piano reasonably well. I need to find work of some kind, and I need to find it quickly, because $23 will not last long even at Mrs. Yardley's rates. Does Caldwell hold any particular attraction for you, or were you only here because of Prout? Only because of Prout, she said. Ralph nodded slowly. He set his hat down on the table beside the lamp and leaned forward with his forearms on his knees. He was not performing thoughtfulness, she noticed. He was actually thinking. There's a general store on 2nd Street where Mrs. Abernathy has been looking for help since her daughter married and moved to Wichita, he said. It's honest work, not glamorous, but it pays regular wages and Mrs. Abernathy is a fair woman. There's also, and I raise this only because you mentioned the piano, there is a church First Methodist that has been without a proper piano player for nearly a year since their previous one moved on. I don't know if that pays enough to matter, but it would be a start. Frances looked at him. You thought all of that out on the walk here, she said. He looked slightly embarrassed. I thought some of it on the way into town, he admitted. You were working out solutions for a stranger's problems before you even arrived. I was raised to believe that a problem in front of you is a problem that belongs to you, he said. And when Cody told me what had happened, that a woman had come all this way and been left standing at the depot with nothing, I won't pretend I wasn't angry. What Prout did was a cowardly, contemptible thing. It was, she agreed simply. She had decided in the 3rd hour of her waiting that she would not diminish what had happened by pretending it was something less than it was. Gerald Prout had taken her letters and her plans and her entire future and simply walked away from them without so much as a word of warning, and that was a cruelty, even if it had been a cruelty born of panic rather than malice. For what it's worth, Ralph said, Prout was not well regarded in this county. He owed debts all over town. I'd heard he was the kind of man who made big promises and delivered very little. He seemed earnest in his letters, she said. Men often seem what they wish to appear to be, Ralph said, and there was a note in his voice that suggested he was speaking from some knowledge of his own. She wanted to ask about that but did not. Not tonight. Tonight they were still strangers. They talked for another hour, longer than she had expected, and Frances found that conversation with Ralph Lockhart was a remarkably easy thing. He was not a man who talked to fill silence, which meant that when he spoke, what he said was worth hearing. He told her a little about the ranch, 6,000 acres of prime grazing land, a sizable herd, 15 full-time hands, a good foreman by the name of Jonas Briggs. And he told her about Caldwell, which he described with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who loved a place without being blind to its flaws. It was a cattle town, he said, which meant it was lively and could be rough, and there were parts of it that a woman would do well to avoid after dark. But there was also a real community here, real families building real lives, and the land itself was extraordinary. She told him a little about Cincinnati, about her parents, about the piano lessons and the small apartment and the matrimonial agency. She spoke plainly, and he listened in the attentive, still way of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. At no point did he look at her with the particular brand of condescension. She had half expected the look that said, "Poor, unfortunate creature," and she appreciated that more than she could have expressed. When they parted for the evening, he stood at the bottom of the porch steps and put his hat back on and looked up at her. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked. "I'd like to introduce you to Mrs. Abernathy if you're willing. And to Pastor Hill at the Methodist Church." "I would like that," she said. He nodded and turned to go and then stopped and turned back. "Miss Donnelly," he said, "for what it's worth, you handled this afternoon with more grace than most people would have managed. I mean that sincerely." She did not know what to say to that, so she simply said good night and went inside. In her room, with the window open to the warm June night and the sounds of Caldwell drifting up from the street below, fiddle music from somewhere, a horse's whinny, voices raised in laughter, she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, finally, the tears she had been holding back all afternoon. Not many. Just enough to acknowledge what had happened. Then she washed her face again and said her prayers and went to sleep. In the morning, Ralph Lockhart arrived at Mrs. Yardley's at 9 o'clock precisely, on a big gray horse that he tied at the post with the ease of long habit. He had shaved, she noticed. He was wearing a clean shirt, dark blue, with his black vest and his boots polished. He still had the same hat, which had seen better decades, and she found that she liked that about him, that he had made the effort to be presentable without attempting to be anything he was not. Mrs. Yardley fed them both breakfast in the dining room with a proprietary air, as if she had personally arranged the whole situation and was pleased with the outcome so far. Her other boarders, two cattle buyers from Texas who were in town for the summer trade, glanced at Frances and Ralph with the frank curiosity of men who were bored and hungry for entertainment, but neither of them spoke out of turn, which Frances suspected was due to the quality of Mrs. Yardley's look when she caught them staring. Mrs. Abernathy's general store was exactly what it sounded like. A long, low-ceilinged room packed from floor to ceiling with everything a household or a ranch could possibly require. Bolts of cloth and sacks of flour and tins of coffee and lamp oil and rope and nails and tobacco and patent medicines, and a whole glass case of hard candy that caught the morning light. Mrs. Abernathy herself was a woman of about 60 with spectacles on a chain and an expression of permanent mild suspicion that softened considerably when Ralph made the introductions. "Piano," she said, when Frances had answered her questions about her skills and her experience. "We could use a piano player at the church. I'll send a note to Pastor Hill." "Mr. Lockhart mentioned that," Frances said. "Did he?" Mrs. Abernathy looked at Ralph with an expression that Frances could not entirely decode. "He's a thoughtful man," she said, "when he chooses to be." She hired Frances on the spot 6 days a week, 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, with Sundays free. The wages were modest but consistent, and Mrs. Abernathy made it clear that she ran a tidy, organized operation and expected the same from everyone in it. Frances agreed to all of it with genuine relief and sincere gratitude. Outside on the boardwalk afterward, Ralph squinted into the late morning sun and said, "That went well." "It did," she agreed. "Thank you again." "You thanked me twice already this morning," he said. "You're welcome twice. You don't owe me a third." She laughed. It surprised her, the ease of it. She had not expected to laugh today. They walked to the Methodist church together, where Pastor Hill, a thin young man with a gentle demeanor and ink perpetually on his fingers, nearly wept with relief at the mention of a piano player. The church piano was a battered upright that had seen a great deal of weather and very little tuning, but when Frances sat down and ran her fingers through the first measures of a hymn, it produced enough of the right sounds that Pastor Hill declared it a miracle and offered her a small Sunday stipend on the spot. She did not look at Ralph when she stood up from the piano bench, but she was aware of him standing near the back of the church, very still, with his arms folded and his head slightly tilted, listening. When she turned around, he was looking at her with an expression she could not name. Not the pity from the day before. Something different. Something she set aside to examine later. June turned into its second week, and Frances found her footing in Caldwell with the determined practicality that had always been her strongest characteristic. She learned the layout of the store and the names of the regular customers. She learned which ranchers paid their accounts promptly and which ones were always about to pay next week. She learned that Mrs. Abernathy liked her tea strong and her opinions stated directly. She learned that Caldwell was divided in the complicated social geography of all cattle towns, the merchant families and the church-going women on one side, the drovers and the gambling establishments and the saloons on the other, and an enormous middle ground of working people who moved between both worlds according to the demands of the day. She also learned, slowly and through accumulated observation rather than any direct inquiry, something of Ralph Lockhart's place in the community. He was, as she had been told, the wealthiest rancher in the county. The Lockhart spread had been built by his father, who had come to Kansas in the early 1860s and had the foresight and the ruthlessness and the extraordinary luck necessary to establish something durable in a land that was hostile to most things that tried to last. Ralph had inherited the ranch at 22 when his father died, and in the decade since he had grown it from a respectable operation into something genuinely remarkable. 6,000 acres, a fine herd of longhorns, and a growing stock of Herefords that Ralph was bringing in as the beef market shifted. A reputation for fair dealing, hard work, and an absolute refusal to be pushed around by anyone. He was also, she learned through the careful intelligence gathering of a woman paying attention, unmarried, had been engaged once, 3 years ago, to a woman named Clara Bishop who had ultimately chosen to return to her family in St. Louis. No one seemed to know precisely why. The women of Caldwell's respectable society had opinions on the subject, of course, and Frances was subjected to several of these opinions in the first 2 weeks of her tenure at the general store, most of them delivered in the confiding tones of women who wanted to be the first to provide important local context. Ralph called on her 4 times in that first 2 weeks. He came to the store and bought things he probably did not need. A new pair of work gloves one day, a tin of Earl Grey tea that struck her as an unusual choice for a cattle rancher, and they talked across the counter the way 2 people talk when they are testing the shape of each other's conversation, finding where the boundaries are, determining what is comfortable and what requires more time. On the 3rd Sunday, he attended the morning service at First Methodist, which he had apparently not done with any regularity for some time, based on the quietly delighted expressions of the congregation. He sat in the 4th pew, and Frances played the hymns from the piano bench and did not look at him during the service, because looking at him during the service would have been unprofessional, and also because she was not yet entirely sure what she would see on his face if she looked, and she was not ready to know. He found her afterward in the churchyard and asked if she would like to ride out and see the countryside. He had brought a second horse, a pretty bay mare named Cinnamon, which told her the invitation had been premeditated and also that he knew how to anticipate. The land east of Caldwell was astonishing. She had seen it from the train, that vast rolling golden emptiness, but seeing it from horseback was a completely different experience. The grass was tall and rippling in the wind, turning silver and then gold as the light moved across it, and the sky above was enormous and absolutely blue, and in the distance, a line of low hills gathered themselves against the horizon like a suggestion. She could smell the dry, warm grass and something beneath it, something earthen and deep, and the air itself seemed thicker somehow, more present, more alive. Ralph rode beside her and said little, but the silence was the easy kind, the kind between 2 people who are comfortable enough not to require constant sound. After a while they stopped on a low rise and looked out across the land, and he said, "My father used to say that this was God's own country before we got to it, and our job was to earn the right to belong to it." She considered that. Did he feel he had earned it? "I don't know," Ralph said. "He died before I could ask him that question. I was still young enough to think I'd have time." She looked at his profile against that enormous sky. He was looking out at the land with an expression she now recognized, the same expression he'd had in the church when she was playing, that particular quality of attention that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy, but something in the territory between them. "I think about the people who were here before your father," she said carefully. "The Osage and the Wichita and others whose land this was for generations. I read about the treaties." Ralph turned to look at her. "So do I," he said, and his voice was quiet but direct. "My father was not a man who thought much about that. I think differently. The land belongs to whoever holds the deed, that's the law, and I operate within the law. But I don't pretend the law was always just in how those deeds came to be." He paused. "I trade with the Osage when they come through, and I pay fair prices, and I don't run them off my land the way some ranchers do. It's a small thing, I know." It was a small thing, but it told her something significant about him, and she filed it away with the other things she was learning. On the way back to town, the bay mare put her foot in a prairie dog hole and stumbled, and Frances lurched forward over the horse's neck with a small, startled cry. And Ralph's hand was there instantly, gripping her forearm, holding her steady, before she had fully processed what had happened. The mare recovered herself in the next breath and everything was fine, but Ralph's hand stayed on her arm for a moment longer, warm and solid through the fabric of her sleeve. Their eyes met. He released her arm and looked straight ahead and said, "Prairie dog holes. You learn to watch for them." "Yes," she said, and her voice came out slightly less steady than she had intended. The summer deepened. Frances settled into the rhythm of Caldwell. The store 6 days a week, the church on Sundays, Mrs. Yardley's table in the evenings, where she gradually became acquainted with the other regular boarders. She wrote letters to the 2 women back in Cincinnati, her former neighbors, and she described her new life with the honest enthusiasm of someone who was genuinely surprised to find themselves building something real in unexpected soil. She also wrote a letter to Gerald Prout, which she had no address to send to, and so she kept it in the drawer of her night table. In it she said everything she had wanted to say to him on that first afternoon at the depot, all the anger and the bewilderment and the plain practical consequences of what he had done. Writing it helped. She did not need to send it to let it go. Ralph came to town twice a week now, on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Wednesday was the day he generally met with his banker or his cattle broker, or handled whatever business the ranch required in town, and he had a habit of ending that business at Mrs. Abernathy's store, where Frances was almost certainly to be found. Saturday was the day his ranch hands came to town, and Ralph came with them, though he did not share their particular entertainments, preferring instead to call at the boarding house in the late afternoon when the heat had begun to ease. They sat on Mrs. Yardley's front porch in the 2 rocking chairs and talked. They talked about everything, it seemed: the state of the cattle market, the question of whether Kansas would hold the cattle drives much longer or push them south as the farming settlements expanded northward, the books Frances had read in her previous life, and the ones she was working through now from the small collection in the church library, the ranch and its animals and its personalities. Ralph told her about Jonas Briggs, his foreman, who was 60 years old and had been on the Lockhart land since before Ralph was born, and was the finest judge of cattle in 3 counties. He told her about Cody Barnes, who had ridden with him since they were both young men, and who now had 3 children and a wife who made the best corn bread in Kansas. He told her about the wild gray wolf that had been picking off his calves in the north pasture all last winter, and the long cold nights he had spent watching for it. She told him about her father, who had been a school teacher with a love of Shakespeare and a complete inability to manage money. She told him about her mother, who had been the practical force that held the family together, and who had died of influenza in the winter of 1879, and left behind a silence that had never quite filled in. She told him about the piano, how she had started lessons at age 6 and how the music had been, for most of her life, the thing that felt most like hers, most entirely her own. "Will you play for me sometime?" he asked one Saturday evening when the sunset was making the western sky look like something a painter had attempted and then exceeded. "Not in church, just for the sake of it." She looked at him. His expression was simply open, simply wanting. "Mrs. Yardley has a piano in her parlor," Frances said. "She doesn't let the boarders use it as a rule." "I'll ask her," he said, and he said it with the kind of quiet confidence that was not arrogance but simply the reasonable expectation of a man who had never found Mrs. Yardley unwilling to accommodate a reasonable request, which it turned out was an accurate expectation, because Mrs. Yardley agreed immediately and then found a reason to be in the kitchen for the next hour. Frances played Chopin first, a nocturne that her mother had loved, and then some Stephen Foster because the summer evening seemed to call for something more familiar. And then, because Ralph was sitting in the wingback chair near the window with his eyes closed and an expression of pure quiet contentment on his face, she played a thing she had written herself years ago, a simple, wandering melody that did not belong to any composer or any tradition, just to her. When she finished, the silence held for a moment. "That last one," he said without opening his eyes. "What was that?" "Mine," she said. He opened his eyes and looked at her across the lamplight. "It was extraordinary," he said. She had been told she played well many times. People thanked her for the hymns and complimented her technique and occasionally said lovely, very lovely when she finished a piece. Not one of them had made her feel what she felt at this exact moment, which was a warmth that started somewhere in the center of her chest and moved outward in a way that she had no interest in examining too closely. July arrived with a heat wave that pressed down on Caldwell like a hot iron, and with it came the summer cattle drives in full force, the great long dusty rivers of longhorns moving up the Kishom Trail from Texas to the railhead, and the drovers who came with them, and all the commerce and commotion and occasional trouble that the drovers generated. The town was louder and more crowded, the streets thick with cattle dust and the sound of spurs and the smell of horses, and the general store was busier than Frances had yet seen it. She was run off her feet from morning until closing, but she found she did not mind it. She liked the work. She liked the constant motion of it and the particular satisfaction of being genuinely useful, of knowing the inventory well enough to put her hand on anything a customer needed without searching, of recognizing the regular customers and knowing their preferences. One afternoon in mid-July, a man came into the store who made the air in the room change. She noticed it immediately, a subtle shift in the way the other customers moved, a drawing in, a careful attention directed elsewhere. He was a big man, heavyset, with a thick red beard and small pale eyes, and the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any given room. He came up to the counter and looked at Frances with those pale eyes and smiled slowly. "New girl," he said. "You must be the one from back east that Prout left behind." His smile made the words into something unpleasant. "I am Frances Donnelly," she said. "May I help you with something?" "Cole Danner," he said, as if she ought to know the name. He leaned on the counter. "What you think of Prout, Miss Donnelly? Man who builds up a woman's hopes and then runs off without a word." "I think it was unkind," she said evenly. "Will you be purchasing anything today, Mr. Danner?" He watched her for a moment, and she kept her eyes on his and her hands flat on the counter. She had been in Cincinnati long enough to know that certain kinds of men were managed most effectively by the complete refusal to give them anything interesting to work with. "Tobacco," he said finally. "2 plugs." She sold him the tobacco and he left, and Mrs. Abernathy appeared from the back room where she had plainly been listening and said, "Cole Danner has the creek crossing spread west of town. 300 acres and a considerably inflated sense of his own importance. He and Ralph Lockhart have been at odds since I can remember, mostly over water rights to Bitter Creek." "Are they at genuine odds?" Frances asked, thinking about the way the room had changed when Danner came in. "There have been words," Mrs. Abernathy said carefully. "Last spring some of Lockhart's cattle turned up on Danner's land and Danner said it wasn't an accident. Lockhart said it was. Nothing came of it legally, but the feeling has been sour ever since." Frances thought about this. She thought about it that evening when Ralph arrived at Mrs. Yardley's porch, and after they had been talking for a while she said, "Cole Danner came into the store today." Something changed in Ralph's face quickly and then smoothed over. "Did he bother you?" "Not in any way I couldn't manage," she said. "Mrs. Abernathy told me something of the history between you." "He's a difficult man," Ralph said. "And he's been looking for a reason to make things more difficult. I'd appreciate it if you keep your distance from him." "I intend to," she said. "But Ralph," she used his given name and noticed him notice it. "If there's going to be trouble with Danner, I'd rather know about it than be surprised by it." He looked at her for a long moment. "There might be," he said. "He's been grazing his cattle on a strip of land along Bitter Creek that he doesn't have clear title to. My lawyer in Wichita says I have the stronger claim. It will likely go before the county land office before autumn. Can he make trouble for your cattle operation in the meantime?" "He can try," Ralph said. I have Jonah's and the boys watching the North Range. She nodded, satisfied to know. They sat with it for a moment and then he said, "You asked for the truth rather than the comfortable version." "I always want the truth," she said. "I know," he said, and the way he said it made her look at him, and she found him looking back at her with that expression that had been appearing more and more frequently in the past weeks, the one she had been deliberately not examining, the one she was now having increasing difficulty continuing to not examine. She looked away at the street. A group of drovers were passing on their horses, raising a little cloud of dust, and somewhere down the block someone was playing a harmonica badly. "Ralph," she said carefully to the street, "I want to ask you something. Ask it. Why do you come here twice a week every week for 6 weeks? You are not in the market for anything I sell at Mrs. Abernathy's, and you attended church perhaps 4 times in the preceding year, and you have a great deal of ranch work that I imagine requires your attention." The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. "I expect you know the answer to that," he said. She turned to look at him then. He was watching her steadily, without evasion. His hat was on his knee, his forearms on his thighs, and he looked like a man who had decided to stop managing an inconvenient truth and was now simply living with it in the open. "I may have a guess," she said. "Frances." He said her name the way a person says a thing they have been thinking about for quite some time. "I came to the depot that first evening because Cody told me and I thought I could be useful, and because a man had done a wrong thing and someone ought to at least try to make it a little less wrong. That was the whole of it then. I will not pretend it is the whole of it now." Her heart was doing something emphatic inside her chest. She kept her voice steady. "It has been 6 weeks. I am aware of that. You don't know me very well. I know you considerably better than most people know their wives at the time of the wedding," he said, with a directness that surprised a short laugh out of her. "And I'm not asking you to make any decisions tonight, Frances. I'm only telling you where I stand so you are not left guessing." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. Above them the stars were appearing, one and then another and then in clusters across the vast Kansas sky. "I came to Caldwell intending to be married," she said at last. "Not to this situation. I know. I am still learning my own footing here. I have been in Caldwell 7 weeks. I know that too. And you are," she said carefully, "considerably more established here than I am. You have land and position and means, and I have a store job and $23 that are now somewhat reduced. None of that is relevant to what I feel," he said. "It might be relevant to what other people think of your judgment," she said. "Turning up at a depot to collect a stranger and then calling on her twice a week." He almost smiled. "I have never found other people's opinions of my judgment to be a useful constraint," he said. She thought about that for a moment. "Neither have I particularly," she admitted. Something shifted between them, some small balance tipping. "I need more time," she said. "Not because I don't know my own mind, but because I respect what this could be enough to want to be sure of it." He nodded immediately, without hesitation, without any of the disappointment she might have expected. "Take all the time you need," he said. "I am not going anywhere." August came in roaring hot, and brought with it a crisis on the Lockhart Ranch that consumed 2 full weeks of Ralph's attention, and removed him from Caldwell almost entirely. The dispute with Cole Danner over the Bitter Creek land had moved from legal maneuvering into something more direct. One of Danner's hired men had cut a section of Ralph's fence along the North Range and driven a group of Danner's cattle through it onto Lockhart land. And when Jonas Briggs and 2 of Ralph's hands had ridden out to assess the damage, they had been met by Danner himself and 4 of his men at the boundary line. And words had been exchanged that made the situation considerably more serious. The county sheriff, a capable man named Elias Thorne, had ridden out to the Bitter Creek boundary himself to hear both sides, and he had warned both parties in very plain terms about the consequences of taking the matter further than the legal system. The land office hearing in Wichita was scheduled for the 14th of September, and until then, Sheriff Thorne told them both, Everyone would keep their cattle and their opinions on their own side of whatever line they agreed upon. Frances heard all of this in pieces, from Cody Barnes' wife Nettie, who came into the store regularly and who had a gift for accurate information delivered without embellishment. Frances also heard it from Ralph himself, who rode into town on a Wednesday afternoon at the end of the first week of August, looking more tired than she had yet seen him, dusty and unshaved, and with something in his eyes that was close to anger but more controlled, more directed inward. She put a cup of coffee in front of him at Mrs. Yardley's kitchen table, which Mrs. Yardley permitted with the knowing air of a woman who had made her assessment of the situation and approved of it, and she sat across from him and listened while he told her everything. He told her about the fence and the cattle and the confrontation at the boundary, and he told her what his lawyer had said about the strength of his claim, and he told her about Jonas Briggs, who was 60 years old and had been shaking with contained fury when Ralph had arrived at the scene because Jonas had been on this land for 40 years and was not prepared to watch any part of it be encroached upon. "Is Jonas all right?" Frances asked. Ralph looked up from his coffee. "He's fine. He has more restraint than he shows, does Jonas. And you," she said, "are you all right?" Another of those pauses that she had learned to read as the moment between what a person would normally say and what they actually meant. "I'm tired," he said. "I don't like being forced into a defensive position. I do things the right way on my land, with my animals, with my people, and I do not need Cole Danner deciding he can take what he hasn't earned." "The hearing is September 14th, she said. "Yes. And between now and then, we watch the fence and we document everything, and we let Elias Thorne do his job," he said, with the careful steadiness of a man who was currently making himself behave better than he wanted to. "I have no intention of giving Danner the kind of confrontation that would hurt my case in Wichita." "Good," she said. He looked at her across the table. He looked tired and frustrated and very human, and she thought of how she had first seen him, that storm of a man coming through the depot door, and how different this was, this man at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the weight of his responsibilities visible on his face, and she found that she preferred the second version, not less but differently, more intimately. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He went very still. "It will be resolved in September," she said. "And you have done everything correctly, and that matters in the long run even when it is frustrating in the short one." He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it, just held it quietly, the warm weight of his fingers around hers. He did not say anything. He did not need to. She understood something then with great clarity. She had come to Caldwell under the worst of circumstances, abandoned by a man she had trusted, left without plans or prospects, forced to build everything from nothing in a place she had never imagined living. And in the 7 weeks since, she had built something. Not just the job and the Sunday playing and the room at Mrs. Yardley's, but this man with his coffee and his battered hat and his honest eyes and his hand warm around hers. And she thought that, whatever the next step was, she was not afraid of it. She left her hand where it was for a long time, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the kitchen floor, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more. September arrived, and with it, the land office hearing in Wichita. Ralph rode to Wichita with his lawyer, a meticulous young man from Ohio, named Mr. Clemens, who had a briefcase full of survey documents and deed records, and was confident in the legal sufficiency of Ralph's position. Frances watched Ralph ride out of Caldwell on a Thursday morning and spent the next 3 days in a state of focused attention that she refused to call worry, though it was probably at least partly worry. He came back on a Saturday, 2 days later, in the early evening. She was on Mrs. Yardley's porch when she heard his horse on the street and stood up and watched him turn in at the post. He dismounted and looked up at her, and she searched his face across the 10 yards between them and found what she was looking for. "You won," she said. "We won," he said. "Full title to the Bitter Creek strip. Danner has 30 days to remove his cattle and repair my fence." She came down the porch steps and stopped in front of him and looked up at him and said, "I am very glad." He was still dusty from the road, still carrying the particular combination of relief and exhaustion that comes after long tension finally releases, and he looked down at her with an expression that had nothing guarded in it whatsoever, and then he said, "Frances, I have been thinking about something for the entire ride back from Wichita." "Tell me," she said. "I want to ask you something. And I want to be clear that this is a real question and not a practical arrangement or a matter of convenience, because I think you have had quite enough of those." "Ask it," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because you came to Caldwell to be married and I happen to be available, not as a resolution to a difficult situation, but because in the 9 weeks since I came running into that depot and found you sitting there on that bench with your spine straight and your chin up and your $23 in your reticule, you have become the most important person in my daily life, and I believe I have become somewhat the same for you, and I would like very much to stop pretending otherwise." The evening light was deep gold and the whole street smelled of horses and dry grass and the faint approaching coolness of the coming autumn, and Frances looked at Ralph Lockhart, at this man who had come running for a stranger and stayed because she was no longer one, and she said, "Yes." He reached up and touched her face with one hand, just briefly, with enormous care, and she leaned into it for a moment. And then they both became aware of the fact that they were standing in the middle of Main Street, and at least 4 people were watching from various vantage points, including Mrs. Yardley from the parlor window. Ralph turned slightly pink around the jaw, which she found extraordinarily endearing. "Supper," he said. "I would very much like to have supper with you if Mrs. Yardley will permit me at the table." "She will," Frances said. "She has been waiting for this conversation for at least 6 weeks." He laughed, and she thought that it was a good laugh, full and genuine, the laugh of a man who did not do it for show but because something had actually struck him as funny, and she thought she would very much like to be the cause of that laugh as often as possible for the rest of her life. They told people in the way of small towns, which is to say that by the following morning it was known by everyone who needed to know it, which was everyone. Mrs. Abernathy said, "I see," in a tone that suggested she had expected this specific outcome since approximately the first week of Frances's employment, and had simply been waiting for the relevant parties to catch up. Cody Barnes shook Ralph's hand so hard and so long that Ralph finally had to extract his fingers by force, and Nettie Barnes hugged Frances warmly and said she had told Cody from the beginning that this would happen and that Cody owed her a new hat. Pastor Hill, when they came to speak with him about the wedding, looked like a man who had received an unexpected and thoroughly welcome blessing. He suggested October, when the heat would have broken and the grass would be turning, and the light on the Kansas plain would be in that particular golden state that made everything look like a painting. The 3rd Saturday of October, they decided. That gave them 6 weeks, which was enough time to do everything that needed doing, and not so much time that the anticipation became unbearable. What needed doing was considerable. The Lockhart Ranch house, Ralph explained with the slight embarrassment of a man presenting something he feared might be found wanting, was a substantial stone structure of 7 rooms that had been built to last but not specifically built to be comfortable. It had good bones and a good roof, and a fireplace in nearly every room, and it was set on a rise with a view across the south pasture that he considered among the finest in Kansas. But it had been managed by him and Jonas Briggs and a ranch cook named Elmer for the past several years, and showed the particular character of a house in which no woman had been involved for quite some time. He took her out to see it on a Sunday afternoon in late September, and she rode Cinnamon again. The bay mare had become her horse by this point, a fact Ralph had noted with quiet satisfaction, and they rode the 4 miles east of town together through the tall autumn grass, and the ranch house appeared ahead of them in the afternoon light, solid and square with its stone walls and its wide porch and its big stone chimney. And Frances thought it was one of the most honestly beautiful things she had ever seen. She walked through the rooms with Ralph beside her, and she said very little, but she was thinking a great deal. The rooms were large and well-proportioned, and the windows were in good positions for light. The kitchen was spacious with a good iron stove and a generous larder. The parlor had 2 good chairs and an empty space against the west wall where a piano would fit perfectly. "Would you consider," she said, looking at that space, "a piano for that wall?" Ralph looked at the space and then at her and said, "I was hoping you'd say that." They were married on the 3rd Saturday of October 1882 in the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, Kansas. And it was a clear and brilliant autumn day with the sky a deep particular blue, and the cottonwoods along the creek already turned to gold. The church was full, which surprised Frances, who had been in Caldwell only 5 months and had not expected to have accumulated so many people to witness her life. But Caldwell was the kind of town that understood the significance of a good wedding and turned out for one with enthusiasm. Nettie Barnes stood with Frances and wept happily throughout the ceremony. Cody Barnes stood with Ralph and managed to keep himself together mostly. Jonas Briggs, who had been brought into town for the occasion at Ralph's insistence, sat in the front pew looking uncomfortable in his good suit and deeply satisfied with the general state of things. Mrs. Yardley sat in the second pew and wore her best brooch and looked like a woman whose sense of narrative had been fully vindicated. Mrs. Abernathy sat behind her and wore an expression of approximately identical satisfaction. Frances wore a dress of ivory wool that she and Nettie had constructed over the past 3 weeks from fabric at the general store, with a high neck and a small train, and a row of pearl buttons at the wrist that had come from a card of buttons that had been sitting in the store's stock for 2 years waiting for the right purpose. She carried a small bouquet of late autumn wildflowers that Ralph had produced with the slightly embarrassed air of a man who had ridden some distance off the main road to find them. She walked down the aisle alone because she had no one to give her away, and she did not find this sad. She had given herself to this new life and this new place and this new person under her own power, and she walked toward Ralph Lockhart under her own power, and when she reached him and he took her hand and she looked up into his face, she found an expression there that she would spend the rest of her life being grateful for plain, unguarded, entirely unashamed love. Pastor Hill spoke the words. They said the words back to him and to each other. The ring Ralph placed on her finger had been his mother's, a simple gold band that he had told her about the week before and offered her the choice of, saying that she was under no obligation to wear something she had not chosen. She had said she would be honored to wear it, and she meant it, and when she looked down at it on her finger as they walked out of the church and into the brilliant October light, she thought that some things were worth more than being new. The town provided a celebration with the generosity that small western towns were capable of when the spirit moved them. A long table of food in the churchyard, fiddle music from 2 of the drovers who it turned out had real talent, dancing on the packed earth while the golden light lasted, and then lanterns lit as it darkened, and the stars came out enormous above the Kansas plain. Ralph danced with her 3 times, and each time he held her as if she were something worth holding carefully, and the 3rd time the music slowed and they moved together slowly in the lantern light, and she rested her face against his shoulder and heard the steady beat of his heart, and she thought that if she had been told on that miserable afternoon at the depot, sitting on a wooden bench with her trunk and her dwindling hope, that this was where she would be in 5 months, she would not have believed it. Which seemed to her to be one of the most useful arguments against giving up that she had ever encountered. They spent their first night in the ranch house, and in the morning Frances woke up in the first genuinely clear dawn she had known in a very long time. The autumn light came through the east window and lay across the floor in long gold bars, and the house was quiet except for the distant sounds of the ranch yard beginning its day, and she lay still for a moment listening to it all and letting it be real. Then she got up and went downstairs and put the stove on for coffee, because that was what the morning required. And when Ralph came downstairs 20 minutes later, he found her standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching a pair of hawks circle above the south pasture. And he came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her from behind and looked out at the pasture with her. And they stood like that for a little while as the day got itself organized around them. He said against her hair, "Good morning, Mrs. Lockhart." She leaned back against him. "Good morning," she said. Fall deepened and winter came early that year to the Kansas plains, bringing with it hard frosts and occasionally snow, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythms. The cattle brought closer to the home pastures, the hay stores drawn upon, the hands doing the interior work that accumulated over a summer of outdoor focus. Ralph was at the ranch most days during the winter months, and Frances found that she did not merely tolerate this but actively appreciated it: the constant proximity, the shared table, the long evenings by the fire. She had left the general store at Mrs. Abernathy's practical insistence. "You have a ranch to run, girl, and Elmer is no one's idea of a household manager." And she found that managing the Lockhart household was a genuinely demanding and genuinely satisfying occupation. The house had needed organization of a kind that Jonas, Briggs, and Elmer had not been equipped to provide, and she provided it with the same focused practicality she had applied to everything else since arriving in Caldwell. She reformed the larder and the household accounts and the seasonal rhythms of the kitchen, and she replaced several things that had needed replacing for some time, and she put a piano against the west wall of the parlor that Ralph had ordered from Kansas City at considerable expense, and that arrived in December on a freight wagon, to the visible delight of every man on the ranch who had not expected to have access to music. She played most evenings after supper, while Ralph sat in his chair with whatever he was reading or the ranch ledgers, and the music went through the house and out the windows and across the dark winter plain. And once Jonas Briggs said to Ralph, out by the barn where he thought he could not be overheard, that it was the nicest thing that had happened to this ranch in a long time, and Ralph agreed with a conviction that Jonas suspected had very little to do with the music specifically. They had their arguments, as all people living closely together inevitably do. Ralph had opinions about how the ranch accounts were kept that differed from Frances's opinions, and Frances had opinions about the condition of the bunkhouse that differed from what Ralph had evidently considered adequate, and there were 2 evenings of real, substantive disagreement about the question of adding a kitchen garden in the spring, which Ralph felt was unnecessary work, and Frances felt was entirely necessary. They both said their pieces and listened to the others, and they found their way through each disagreement to something that was not always exactly either person's original position, but was better, on the whole, than either position alone. She discovered that he was a deeply private person about certain things about the years after his father's death, when he had been very young and very alone running a ranch that was at the time struggling, about the engagement to Clara Bishop that had ended as it had, and she did not push at these privacies. She waited, and over the winter, in the way of things shared between people who are genuinely intimate, they came to her in their own time. He told her about those early years at the ranch, the particular loneliness of them, the determination that had kept him going when it would have been easier to sell. He told her about Clara, not bitterly, not with the performance of getting over it, but honestly, that they had wanted different things, and that the honesty of that had been painful but was ultimately better than the alternative. She told him, in return, the things she had not said yet, about the real fear of the first week in Caldwell, the middle-of-the-night fear that she had made an irreversible mistake and that there was no good outcome available to her, about the grief for her parents that she carried still, not constantly but in the particular moments when a thing would happen that she would want to tell her mother, About the letter to Gerald Prout that she still had in the drawer of the night table, the letter she had never sent. "What would you want to do with it?" Ralph asked. "I think I'd like to burn it," she said. "Not out of anger, just to close it." They burned it in the kitchen stove on a January evening, and it caught and was gone in about 2 seconds, and Frances felt the appropriate and complete smallness of that. Spring came to the Kansas plain in the way that spring always does there, suddenly and overwhelmingly, as if winter had been keeping all the color and warmth and noise under a very heavy lid, and had now removed the lid all at once. The grass greened up almost overnight, and the birds came back in numbers, and the ranch yard filled with the particular productive chaos of spring calving. Ralph was out at all hours for 3 weeks, and Frances made a habit of riding out to wherever he was working with coffee and food at midday, until Ralph's hands had started placing bets on the precise time she would appear over the rise. In April, Frances suspected something and said nothing about it for 2 weeks, and then she said something to Mrs. Yardley when she went into town to call, because Mrs. Yardley was the kind of woman who knew about these things and could be trusted completely. Mrs. Yardley confirmed what Frances had suspected and advised her with the no-nonsense practicality of a woman who had helped more than one younger woman through the same territory. She told Ralph on an evening in late April when the sky was doing something extraordinary with its sunset colors, standing on the porch together with the last of the light on the south pasture. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and she watched his face and saw everything she needed to see: the disbelief first, then the understanding, then something so large and unguarded that it temporarily appeared to have removed his ability to speak. Then he picked her up, just simply put his arms around her and lifted her off the porch boards, and she laughed and said carefully, "Please," and he set her back down immediately and took her face in both his hands and looked at her with the expression she thought she would see in her memory for the rest of her life. "Frances," he said. "I know," she said. Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "And you are going to ask me that question approximately once a day from now until November. And I want you to know in advance that I find it endearing, and you should continue." He laughed, which released something, and they stood on the porch together in the fading light, and she leaned against him and thought about how this particular collection of circumstances, the depot, the bench, the $23, the man who came running, had led to this exact evening, and found that she was not able to assign it to anything as simple as luck or fate, but felt it was something more collaborative than either, something that had been made by two people paying attention to what was in front of them. Cole Danner, who had complied with the court order and removed his cattle and repaired the fence line, and apparently concluded that the better part of valor was a period of quiet, turned up in May at the ranch boundary on a horse and asked to speak with Ralph man to man. Frances was in the kitchen garden that Ralph had ultimately and wholeheartedly agreed to when she saw him ride up, and she watched from the garden with the attention of a woman who was paying close attention to everything that concerned her family. The conversation between Ralph and Danner lasted about 20 minutes, and at the end of it they shook hands briefly, without warmth, but shook hands nonetheless, and Danner rode away. Ralph came to the garden fence and leaned on it and said, "He wants to sell the creek crossing property, going back to Missouri. His heart was never in ranching, it turns out. He wanted to know if I was interested." "Are you?" Frances asked. "I am," he said, "but it's a significant purchase." "Is it reasonable land at a reasonable price?" "It's reasonable land at a reasonable price given the circumstances," he said. "Then buy it," she said, and went back to her garden, and he watched her for a moment with the expression of a man who had a great deal to be grateful for and was fully aware of it. He bought the creek crossing property in June, and the water rights dispute that had been at the root of everything was resolved simply by the two formerly disputed parties becoming the same party, which was perhaps less dramatic than a legal solution, but considerably more efficient. The combined property, with the Bitter Creek strip secured, made the Lockhart Holdings the most extensive single ranch in Sumner County. The summer moved through its long gold days, and Frances's garden came up spectacularly: tomatoes and beans and summer squash and herbs, and a wild, optimistic explosion of sunflowers along the back fence that delighted everyone, and that Elmer, who had initially been skeptical of the garden, adopted with an enthusiasm that he was not fully prepared to acknowledge. She played the piano on the evenings when the heat allowed the parlor to be pleasant, and she played at the church on Sundays, with the small roundness of her middle becoming gradually more apparent beneath her good dress. And Pastor Hill beamed at her every week with a joy that was entirely disproportionate to his professional duties, but entirely consistent with his character. Nettie Barnes visited twice a week and talked with the informed authority of a woman who had 3 children and was therefore a reliable source of practical information. Ralph, as Frances had predicted, asked her daily whether she was well, and she told him daily that she was perfectly well, and occasionally she was tired or uncomfortable, and told him that too, because she had no interest in performing wellness she did not feel. And on those days, he was quietly and persistently attentive in ways that she found she loved without reservation. In August, she wrote a letter to her 2 former neighbors in Cincinnati and told them about the baby coming and about the ranch and about Ralph, and she described Caldwell with the warm familiarity of someone who had stopped being a newcomer to it. And she described the land, the grass and the sky and the hawks and the incredible Kansas sunsets, with something that she recognized as affection. The letter she received back from Margaret Home, the more literary of the 2, said, among other things, that it sounded as if Frances Donnelly had landed on her feet, and Frances read this and thought that landing on one's feet was one way to describe it, though it did not quite capture the experience of the fall itself, or the way the landing had been assisted by a man with honest eyes and a battered hat who had come through a depot door running. On the 4th of November, in the bedroom of the ranch house with the autumn wind outside and a fire going and Mrs. Yardley and the doctor both in attendance, Frances gave birth to a son. He was a healthy, loud, vigorous boy who made his presence known with great conviction, and who, when Ralph was finally allowed into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and held him for the first time, opened his eyes and looked up at his father with an expression of enormous and dignified consideration. Ralph held his son and did not say anything for quite a long time. Frances watched him from against her pillows, tired and clear-eyed and more completely happy than she had believed was available to her, and thought that this was what the bench at the depot had been the beginning of, this exact room and this exact evening and this particular family that had been built from nothing but 2 people willing to pay attention. They named him James Henry Lockhart, James for Ralph's father whose middle name it had been, Henry for Frances's father who had read Shakespeare to her on Sunday afternoons in a small Cincinnati apartment, and who she thought would have liked this man his daughter had married and this land his daughter had found. James Henry was a loud and opinionated infant who became a loud and opinionated toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and an absolute conviction that everything in the ranch house and the ranch yard was of personal relevance to him. Ralph, who had built a vast and successful cattle operation through force of will and shrewd attention, was comprehensively undone by his son from approximately the first week, and the ranch hands found this hilarious and deeply satisfying. Jonas Briggs, who had been on the Lockhart land for 40 years and had seen quite a lot, told Cody Barnes one evening while they were mending fence that the boy had his grandfather's look about him, meaning the elder Lockhart, and that he thought the ranch was in good hands for the generation after next. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a good one for the Lockhart ranch. The cattle prices held strong and the range was in good condition, and Ralph finished the purchase of the additional land east of Bitter Creek that completed the property boundary he had been working toward for several years. He was not a man who gloated about success, But Frances could see the particular quiet satisfaction of a thing properly finished in the way he looked out at the land from the porch on winter evenings, the whole long sweep of it visible from the rise where the house sat. She had her piano. She had her garden, which she was already planning to expand in the spring with particular attention to herbs for cooking, and a section of cutting flowers because she saw no reason why a working ranch should not also have flowers. She had Mrs. Yardley, who drove out in her trap every Sunday afternoon, through even the worst of the winter weather for tea and conversation, and the enjoyment of young James, who treated her visits as a personal performance opportunity. She had Nettie Barnes and Cody and their 3 children who came for Sunday dinner once a month and filled the ranch house with noise and life. She had Mrs. Abernathy, who had become a genuine friend, and who occasionally appeared on a Saturday with a package of something from the store that she claimed was surplus, but was clearly a deliberate gift. She had Jonas Briggs's annual Christmas tobacco. He gave every woman on the ranch property a cake of tobacco each December for reasons that were never explained, and that Frances did not investigate, because some traditions were worth preserving simply for the mystery. She had Ralph. There were evenings in the second year of their marriage when she would come into the parlor with the baby on her hip and find Ralph standing at the window that looked out over the south pasture with the particular stillness that meant he was thinking something through, and she would come and stand beside him, and they would look out together at whatever the sky was doing over the Lockhart land, and she would know without needing to say it that they were both aware of the same thing. The improbability of this exact particular happiness, the series of accidents and choices that had produced it, the woman from Cincinnati who had nothing, and the rancher from Kansas who had everything but the one thing that mattered. Spring of 1884 brought something new. Frances, who had been teaching James to recognize his letters with the serious pedagogical commitment of the piano teacher's daughter, found herself thinking about the other children in the county who had limited access to education. The nearest proper school was in Caldwell itself, 4 miles away, and not every ranch family could manage that distance in winter or during the busy seasons. She raised this with Ralph over supper one evening, and he listened with the attentive quality she had come to rely on, asking questions that showed he was genuinely thinking about the problem. By June, they had converted the old stone storage building at the east edge of the ranch yard into a one-room schoolhouse with whitewashed walls and 6 benches and a blackboard. And Frances had informed the families of the 3 nearest homesteads and 2 of the smaller ranch operations within 5 miles that school would be held on Tuesday and Thursday mornings from 8 until noon. 7 children appeared on the first Tuesday morning, ranging in age from 5 to 11, with an 8th who had hidden behind the fence post until Frances came and personally invited her in. Ralph stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse that first morning with James balanced on his forearm and watched his wife call the class to order, and he thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, that the most consequential thing he had ever done was run through a depot door on a June evening in 1882 to find a woman sitting on a bench with her spine straight and her chin up and $23 in her reticule. She looked up and caught him looking, and she gave him a look that was affectionate and exasperated in equal measure, which was a look he had learned to cherish, and she said firmly to the class, "Open your readers to the first page, please," and 7 children, and the one who had been hiding behind the fence post all did exactly that. James, who was not quite 2 and had no business having opinions about education, pointed at the blackboard and said something emphatic. "He agrees," Ralph told Frances. "Splendid," she said. "Go away, both of you." He laughed and went away, and the school session of the Lockhart Ranch continued, and the day was fine, and the grass was very green, and the hawks were circling above the south pasture, and the great Kansas sky was the particular blue it turned in early summer that made everything under it look like the beginning of something worth being alive for. By the autumn of 1884, Frances was expecting their second child, which she announced to Ralph on a September morning with the matter-of-fact calm of a woman who was no longer surprised by the life she was building, though she was not less grateful for it. Ralph's response was identical in its essential character to his response. The first time, the temporary removal of his capacity for speech, followed by the careful picking up of his wife from the floor on which she was standing. And Frances told him again about the daily wellness inquiries and advised him to continue them. And he said he absolutely would, and kissed her with a sincerity that made the kitchen seem considerably brighter. Their daughter was born in April of 1885, small and fierce, and immediately determined to have her own opinion about every aspect of the world into which she had arrived. They named her Catherine Louise, Catherine for no one in particular but because it suited her, and Louise for Nettie Barnes, whose given name it was, and who had been such a steadfast friend from the very beginning that she deserved to be carried in a name. James, who was 2.5, regarded his sister for a long, solemn moment when Ralph brought him in to meet her, and then patted her very carefully on the head with one finger and said she was small. Ralph agreed that she was currently small, but predicted she would get larger. James seemed willing to give this a chance. Caldwell changed over the years as all frontier towns change. The cattle drives gradually moving southward as the Kansas farming settlements expanded, and the laws governing open range hardened, the railroads extending further west, the rough edges of the town softening as the permanent families accumulated and the institutions grew more established. Ralph had foreseen some of this and had been gradually shifting the Lockhart operation toward the registered Hereford stock that the changing market would require. And when the great drives thinned out, and some of the other ranchers who had not adapted found themselves in difficulty, the Lockhart ranch continued steady and strong. The schoolhouse on the east edge of the ranch yard had become, by 1886, a proper twice-weekly institution with 12 regular students, and Frances had hired a young woman from Caldwell, a recent graduate of the normal school in Emporia named Miss Ada Keene, to assist with the older students while Frances focused on the younger ones. This arrangement worked well for everyone involved, and Ada Keene proved to be not only an excellent teacher but also, Frances eventually noticed, a frequent subject of Jonas Briggs's increasingly dignified attention, which development she reported to Ralph one evening, and which Ralph found implausible until he himself observed it, at which point he agreed that Jonas was apparently a man of hidden depths. They did not interfere. They watched with appreciation. Cody and Nettie Barnes added a fourth child to their household in 1886, and the Sunday dinners at the Lockhart Ranch acquired the comfortable chaos of a genuine extended family, with 7 children ranging in age from infant to 8 years old, and various adults in various states of engagement with the proceedings. Elmer, the ranch cook who had survived Frances's household reforms and had eventually come to embrace them, produced these Sunday dinners with a creative ambition that he attributed to the influence of the kitchen garden and the piano music, neither of which influences he could fully explain, but both of which he considered positive. Ralph turned 36 in 1886, and Frances turned 30 in the same year, and on her birthday he gave her a mare of her own, a pretty Appaloosa named Pearl because of the pattern on her coat, and also a new piece of music shipped from Kansas City, a collection of Schubert pieces that she had mentioned wanting months before, and that he had clearly filed and acted upon at the appropriate moment, which was the kind of particular attention that she never stopped finding meaningful. She gave him, for his birthday, an evening to himself in the parlor where she played every piece of music he had ever expressed any preference for in their 4 years of conversation, which took 2 hours and covered everything from the hymns he had grown up with at his mother's insistence to the Chopin nocturnes she had introduced him to in the early months, and that he had decided, with characteristic directness, that he liked very much. When she finished, he was sitting in his chair with the expression she thought of now as fully his, the one that was not quite sorrow and not quite joy but something in the richer territory between them, the expression of a man who was aware of being genuinely alive. "What are you thinking?" she asked, from the piano bench. "That I came very close to not going to the depot that evening," he said. "Cody told me, and I thought about whether it was any of my business. I almost decided it wasn't." She looked at him across the parlor, the lamplight warm between them. Outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars. Down the hall, James and Catherine were asleep in their beds. Somewhere in the ranch yard, a horse moved with a quiet sound of hooves on packed earth. "What made you go?" she asked. "I kept thinking about a woman sitting alone on a bench in that station," he said. "And I thought that if I were that woman I would want someone to come. So I went." She crossed the parlor to his chair, and he reached up and took her hand, and she sat on the arm of the chair beside him the way she had taken to doing in the evenings, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the lamplight and listened to the night outside. This was the Lockhart Ranch in the autumn of 1886, the stone house on the rise with its 7 rooms and its fires and its piano, the kitchen garden where the last of the autumn herbs still stood, the schoolhouse with its 12 students, the south pasture where the Hereford cattle moved in the morning light, the north range secured by legal deed along the full length of Bitter Creek, the east addition that had been the creek crossing property and was now simply part of the whole. The ranch hands who had their own histories and their own loyalties, Jonas Briggs, who was 64 years old and showed no inclination to slow down, Elmer, who had learned 6 new things about cooking from the garden and was prouder of this than he would ever admit, Cody and Nettie Barnes and their 4 children who were as close as family, Mrs. Yardley, who drove out every Sunday in her trap, Mrs. Abernathy, who came with packages from the store, Pastor Hill, who still beamed at Frances every Sunday, as if she had personally arranged the musical ambitions of the Almighty. And at the center of all of it, Ralph Lockhart and Frances Donnelly Lockhart, who had found each other in the most improbable way, and had built from that improbability something as solid and enduring and necessary as the stone walls of the house itself. Years later, when James was old enough to understand stories and Catherine was old enough to correct any inaccuracies her brother introduced, Frances would sometimes tell them the story of how she had come to Caldwell. She told it plainly, without embellishment, because the plain truth was already dramatic enough to require no decoration. The journey from Cincinnati, the depot platform, the bench, the 3 hours of waiting in the growing understanding that no one was coming. And then she would say, "The door opened." And their father would look up from whatever he was doing across the room with that expression. Not quite sorrow, not quite joy, something better than both. And she would meet his eyes over the heads of their children, and they would share the small private knowledge of 2 people who have been through the hard part together and come out the other side into something worth everything the hard part cost. James, who had his father's directness and his mother's insistence on accuracy, always wanted to know exactly how fast Ralph had been running when he came through the door. Ralph, when asked, said he had been moving at a purposeful pace. Frances said he had been running. Ralph said that was a matter of perspective. Catherine, who was 4 and had her grandmother's gift for shutting down unproductive discussions, said that either way he had arrived. And wasn't that the point? And everyone agreed that it was entirely the point. And the lamp burned warmly in the parlor, and outside the Kansas night held all its vast dark stars, and the Lockhart Ranch went on. And the story that had begun with a forgotten bride on a depot bench and a rancher who came running had become what all the best stories become when they are given enough time and enough care. Not an ending, not a beginning, but a life, fully and completely and joyfully lived.